So we're all good. Let's go and present our first speaker, Magnus Oden. You're warmly welcome. And Magnus Oden, you're Nordic and CEE head at UN's Principle for Responsible Investments. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me today, and good morning, everybody. It's a timely seminar on a topic that increasingly is the spotlight in Sweden and elsewhere now that we work to uncover the issues and set an agenda on how we can move forward to improve on the quality of working lives for everyone. Before I go through this slide deck, can I just ensure that you all can see this properly? And if I run into technical problems, will you let me know, please? So it is universally understood that human capital is a key factor that determines the health of all businesses. In that framing, we're used to concepts such as attracting, developing, rewarding, and retaining staff being key goals. However, that is a narrow and transactional perspective on our daily working lives and does little, frankly, to address what really drives performance for organizations. More recently, there is a shift taking place among leading businesses to an approach that is not shaped from a human capital framework, but instead is human-centric. The aim in those companies is to create an environment where everyone is given an equal opportunity to belong and set to a task where they can build a career over time. But why am I talking about this in the context of investors and their portfolio management? Well, to illustrate that value can be unlocked by this human-centric approach, a study by consulting company Accenture estimated that companies that score well on inclusive policies on disability are 2 times more profitable than those who don't. The same companies have a 4-time likelihood to outperform their peers. There are other research pieces that point in the same direction. So by extension, such studies are really telling in that strong D&I performance has a positive correlation to profitability. So it has now become a shareholder issue. If inclusion is ignored, the business is likely to fall behind. And thus, from an ownership perspective, the value of your investment will go down. But even ignoring this fact around economic returns, from an ownership perspective, the diversity and inclusion dimension is no longer an optional good to have. It is in fact a requirement since 2011 as formalized by the UN and the OECD. Expectations since have grown, not only in visibility and from the urgency played out by the COVID pandemic, youth unemployment, but also through a conversation around what investors' responsibilities look like and how that needs to be reflected across their investment activities. Acknowledging that 11 years on, investors are still at early stages of exploring a sound approach fit for purpose, but we are seeing an increasing number of good examples of ways to tackle the Sustainable Development Goal number 8 on decent work. And these new processes help their portfolio companies to develop a better practice of their responsibilities towards the D&I requirements. As understood, supply chains for businesses improve and more competitive workforce emerge through higher motivation, increased productivity, and more developed skills. So let me talk you through what the task at hand is for investors, what the 4 areas of their responsibility is, and touch upon the big challenges and how investors can approach it. So investors have a 3-part responsibility to respect human rights and decent work through policy commitment in their own operation and at investee companies, through due diligence processes in their investment work, and by enabling or providing access to remedy when things aren't quite right. The policy component is the starting point and is simply spelling out what the responsibility is and what tools are used to align with the policy. The United Nations Guiding Principles for Human Rights, OECD's guidelines for multinational enterprises, or ILO's core conventions are helpful formulations. For investors to properly understand their risk exposures, they need to seek information so that they understand the human rights outcomes and how they themselves are linked to those risks through their ownership. And this can be a challenge because public disclosure of human rights data is often lacking. So investors need to explore the information gaps across the value chain to understand and uncover those risks. In addition, the due diligence includes their global portfolio holdings across geographies, including in the supply chain. If decent work and human rights conditions are compromised, investors can and should address the situation with their portfolio companies, possibly along with other owners in collaboration. They can also liaise with policymakers if all else fails. They can shift allocation in portfolios, put simply, sell holdings in companies where there is a risk for human rights abuse, which impacts the financials and the corporate reputation. To do this, there are 4 specific pillars to check to ensure that investment holdings are complying with regulation, that they're up to expectations within society, and of course, meet their own set standards, both in companies where they are shareholders as well as where they are bond investors. And those 4 pillars are based on the work by OECD and ILO and is aligned with the international frameworks to assist investors when setting up their systematic screening. So the first pillar is workers' voice and social dialogue. This includes establishing how a business engages with workers, that they allow associations, that they can collectively bargain, enjoy freedom of expression. There must also be formalized procedures to deal with any concerns and grievances. The second pillar is pay. So naturally, work is meant to secure steady income over time, reflective of qualification and position, and must allow to save up for rainier days. This may sound quite expected in our part of the world, but with the changing texture of the workforce to large cohorts of self-employment and with persistent high youth unemployment, this needs to be scrutinized as startups and powerful large organizations have been found to operate near the border of abuse against the spirit of the existing regulation, exploiting such vulnerabilities. The third pillar is related to benefits such as pension contributions, paid time off, and healthcare. Again, we may take it for granted in our part of the world, but not so at suppliers to Western companies operating in developing countries. Sometimes there are examples in our part of the world too, where the gig economy is growing and is increasingly used by established large businesses to drive down costs. The fourth and last pillar is probably at the center of today's onward discussions, and it's about the treatment of people and the personal and developmental level. There is an expectation by institutional owners of companies that they offer personal development in education, in training, advancement. The task is to eliminate the gaps of what a place of work should represent to the people who are employed there. Businesses are increasingly scrutinized and expected to identify their own areas of improvement needs, and owners have a duty to ensure that it gets done. The relevant measure is to close a gap so that the place of work more resembles a socially safe place where each and everyone has significance and dignity among colleagues, and that it is a place where people will want to work. This increases retention and loyalty and creates a pathway to personal satisfaction and success. The task is to create a space where social ties to colleagues, subordinates, and bosses alike become meaningful connections, and that the culture becomes a fabric with social cohesion. So the key aim, as described, is for investors to identify salient workers' rights and to fast-track implementation of stronger governance of decent work principles at portfolio companies. Challenges are in abundance, of course, constantly changing as we progress. The digital transformation and automation is a big issue. The vicious circle of working poverty, another one. Persistently high youth unemployment, that's a real concern. We have lots of work ahead to address all these issues in a fast-changing world. Investors as owners have a unique position to steer their investment companies at scale in a more sustainable direction on decent work issues. Progress on good governance and oversight is key. As a regulatory momentum is building, the best response to get ahead is to get started. The benefit is not only the satisfaction from doing good, but also to create a more resilient labor market and to contribute to a healthy and prosperous society, whilst improving portfolio returns and reducing the financial and reputational risks. So this concludes my talk. Thank you for listening. I now hand back to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Magnus. So you say that decent work is making its way up on investors' agenda. What would you say is the primary driver for that shift?
Thank you. That's a good question, Sophia. So I think there are two key drivers, really, I would say. And among the leading companies, so shaping a competitive business always takes the front seat. And for them, introducing strong policies and practices for inclusion rhymes really well with their passion to lead and has also proved to develop a financial superiority. The other driver is from the other end, and it's the pace of regulation. We have reason to anticipate introduction of regulatory requirements in this area, and this will involve all other businesses too.
Perfect.
Frankly, diversity and inclusion criteria will over time become part of the license to operate, irrespective of sector and geography.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Magnus.
And we hope so too, we should say.